There's a door in Lower Manhattan they say no one should ever open. Behind it, not ghosts, not monsters, something worse. Records wiped. Families erased. And in the soot black heart of it all, one name still rots beneath the city's surface. Murphy. Not a man, not a woman, not even a family, really. A system. A machine of psychological terror dressed in the velvet of Catholic charity. They called it an asylum. But it wasn't built to heal. It was built to erase. Between 1834 and 1867. Beneath the cobblestones of Manhattan's respectable veneer, the Murphy family operated a private institution for the irredeemable. A place where the unwanted, the unprofitable, and the inconvenient were silently vanished. Children, women, immigrants, dissidents, no records, no names, only ashes and silence. And while the world whispered about the 5 Points or the gangs of New York, the Murphys built a network of shadow obedience, deep within the church, the courts, and the mayor's office. And here's what they never told you: this family didn't just run a building, they ran minds. Early psychological manipulation. Hypnosis under the guise of spiritual cleansing. We're talking 13-year-old girls shackled in prayer closets for weeks, until they confessed sins they never committed. They weren't punished for evil. They were trained to forget who they were. One survivor, if you can call her that, wrote in 1872 that you didn't walk out of Murphy's. You were reborn in their image or buried under it. This is not a ghost story. This is an institutional bloodline, buried deep beneath your textbooks, behind cathedral doors, inside legal names that still sit on real estate boards today. And now you're going to see how it worked. What they did. And how their psychological blueprints still control men like you. Even now. But I have to warn you, once you know this, you can't go back to sleep. You asked for power. What you're about to hear is the price. They never needed chains. Not when they had faith. Not when they had fear dressed up as salvation. You see, the Murphy family understood something long before psychology was a science. That the most efficient form of control is voluntary obedience. And the fastest way to achieve it is to weaponize God. From the outside, their institution looked like a blessing: carved stone, stained glass, choir hymns echoing through narrow alleyways. It was called Our Lady of Pure Mercy, a place where fallen girls could repent, where wayward orphans could be reformed, where immigrants, mostly Irish, Italian, Polish, could be saved from sin and integrated into society. But inside, it was a cathedral of psychological war. The Murphys didn't beat the soul out of you. They whispered it away. They started with the name. You weren't Mary anymore. You were Subject 9. You weren't Patrick. You were Brother Redemptus. Your identity was stripped, your history burned, and in its place a doctrine. Obedience, purity, confession, silence. They trained boys to turn in their sisters, girls to write down the sins of their roommates. Brother watchers kept logs. Notebooks were passed like scripture. If you were caught resisting, you weren't punished with violence. You were exiled from the light. You were left in the void. That wasn't a metaphor. It was a real place. A soundproofed room in the basement. Zero light, no sound. You didn't know if it was day or night. They called it a reflection chamber. And after 3 days, most children begged to come back, not to escape, but to confess, to submit. By 1841, the Murphy Institute had broken over 300 children, all with clean legal documentation, all blessed by church and city officials. And the people, they clapped. They donated. They thanked the Murphys for their civilizing mission. They never saw what happened beneath the chapel. They never wanted to. Because the real genius of the Murphy family wasn't cruelty. It was camouflage. Every atrocity baptized in good intentions. Every broken mind written in Latin verse. And if you think this was just one dark family in one dark time, you've already missed the point. Their methods live on. In your schools, your churches, your courts. You don't call it Murphy anymore. Now you just call it normal. He wore the collar of a priest, but he was no man of God. Not really. Father Killian Murphy was the first to take the family name and turn it into something eternal. Not through blood. Through ideology. You've heard of tyrants, madmen, abusers. But Killian was different. He didn't yell. He whispered. He didn't strike. He waited until you struck yourself. Born in 1791, Killian was the illegitimate child of a nun and a Jesuit defector, raised in secrecy, educated in silence, and trained in the Society of the Mind, a secret sect within the church known for conducting cognitive experiments on the clergy. By 24, Killian had memorized over 200 liturgical texts, but more importantly, he'd mastered cognitive deprivation techniques, isolation doctrine, and what he called spiritual inversion. The act of breaking down a soul by convincing it that its instincts were sin. He brought these ideas to Manhattan in 1833 under the pretense of opening a charity for orphan girls. But from day one, the mission wasn't salvation. It was submission. Killian believed in what he called the ladder of control. 4 steps separate them from their past. Replace their name. Induce guilt for thoughts they didn't choose. Offer absolution only in exchange for obedience simple, deadly, permanent. Killian didn't see himself as cruel. He saw himself as a gardener, pruning minds to grow in his direction. And by 1840, the garden was full. Judges sent him the unmanageable. Priests funneled him the possessed. And the mayor, he personally endorsed the Murphy method for reforming the moral character of the poor. Behind stained glass, girls were drugged with laudanum and forced into hour-long prayers that repeated phrases like, "I am not worthy of choice." Boys were made to chant, "The law is above my will." Every repetition was a carving into the subconscious. Every whisper was a stitch in the puppet's string. And Killian? He just sat in the pulpit smiling. One survivor described his presence like this: "Never touched me. He didn't have to. He made me erase myself with gratitude." That's the kind of power most men will never understand. But the elite, they study it, they copy it, they use it on you. You think you're free. Then ask yourself, whose voice plays in your head when you make a decision? Because if it isn't yours, it just might be his. You've heard of torture. But this wasn't waterboarding. This wasn't broken bones or beatings. This was far worse. They called it the Chamber of Reversal. A stone room 6 feet underground, lined not with chains, but mirrors. Not a single one reflected you as you were. Some were warped. Some inverted your movements. Some delayed your reflection by several seconds. Inside this chamber, you didn't just see yourself differently. You questioned if you were ever real at all. This room was Killian Murphy's masterpiece. His crucible. The place where sinners became saints, not through repentance but through psychological dismemberment. Here's how it worked. Children were brought down blindfolded, the door locked with 3 iron bolts behind them. No noise, no light, just silence and cold. And then, a faint candle. The mirrors slowly illuminated. A voice from a hidden grate would read scripture. Backward. "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the yoke. The Lord hears only the silent. The body is wicked. The will is illusion. The Father is all." This would go on for 6 hours. Then the questions would begin. Why do you fear freedom? Whose thoughts are these? When did your mind betray you? The mirrors played tricks. One made your mouth move out of sync. Another showed you, but blinking when you weren't. Some children screamed. Some laughed uncontrollably. But most just broke. By the 3rd session, they stopped resisting. They asked to return. They begged to see Killian, to confess to crimes they never committed. But this was never about sin. It was about ownership. Once the mind questions itself, it becomes vulnerable. It looks outward for direction. And that's where the Murphys stepped in, offering order, clarity, and purpose in exchange for the one thing they couldn't take: your inner voice. Do you understand what that means? They didn't brainwash these children. They made the children do it to themselves. That's the key. That's the ancient science of obedience. Destroy identity, then offer a lifeboat. And that lifeboat was a leash. There's a reason this chamber was destroyed in 1872. Because men in power still use the blueprint. They just changed the mirrors. Now they call them screens. By 1847, something began to happen around the Murphy institution that no one dared talk about in public. Not the priests, not the judges, not even the families. People were vanishing. Not en masse. That would have drawn attention. But precisely, quietly, strategically, you had a cousin who got in trouble, sent to the Murphys for discipline. Never came back. A housemaid who spoke out against her employer's abuses, gone. Last seen walking through the cathedral's iron gate. But no funerals, no grave markers, no letters, no bodies. They were simply erased, not just from life but from the archives. Birth records altered, census rolls corrected. And the families, paid off, excommunicated, or discredited as mentally unstable. This wasn't charity, it was a cleansing system. Killian Murphy once said in a private letter, and I quote, "There are weeds not fit for burning. Some must simply be unremembered." Understand this, we're not talking about punishment. We're talking about administrative deletion. A process so clean it left no stain. The Murphy family didn't see themselves as sadists. They saw themselves as curators of order. Every disappearance was a subtraction from chaos. Every vanished child, a correction to the moral fabric of the city. And here's the terrifying part, it worked. Crime rates dropped. Public disorder waned. The neighborhoods surrounding the Murphy chapel prospered. Why? Because fear was the mortar between every brick. People didn't know the details. They just knew this: you don't talk back. You don't ask questions. And you don't get sent to the Murphys. It became a cultural reflex, a Pavlovian conditioning, a silent agreement that the well-behaved survive and the rest become unspoken. And this legacy, it didn't end in the 1800s. It just changed shape. Today, the disappearances aren't physical. They're economic, digital, spiritual. You say the wrong thing online? Gone. Disagree with the narrative? Shadow banned. Ask the wrong questions? Labeled. Dismissed. Erased. Because the Murphy method was never just about obedience. It was about containment. And if you think you're immune, if you think you're too smart, too aware, too independent, then ask yourself, when was the last time you said something real, without wondering who was watching? There was a book, not listed in the cathedral's records, not mentioned in the archives of the church or the city, bound in dark green leather, locked in a silver clasp, and passed only by hand from one Murphy to the next. They called it the Book of Thorns. It wasn't a journal. It was a manual, 127 pages of techniques, sequences, and rituals for shaping minds, isolating will, and engineering loyalty. And yes, it still exists. Last seen in 1914, auctioned under code at a private estate sale attended by 5 American families, all with surnames you'd recognize. But they won't admit they bought it. They never do. Here's what we do know about its contents. Thanks to 2 pages recovered by a former seminarian who fled the Murphy network in 1866. The first section was titled, Reversal Through Reward. It detailed how to make obedience feel like a privilege, not a punishment, praise the compliant, elevate the obedient, isolate the questioner, mock the divergent, create the illusion of freedom while quietly shrinking its borders. The second section, The Silence Engine. It showed how to build feedback loops where the victim polices themselves, implant guilt, encourage self-reporting, reward betrayal of peers as righteous sacrifice. Sound familiar? Because you're living in it. Ever wonder why so many men feel like they can't speak freely? Why your gut says something's wrong, but your lips stay shut? Why you doubt your instincts, second-guess your words, and bite your tongue even when no one's watching? That's not insecurity. That's conditioning. The Book of Thorns wasn't just about power. It was about permanent programming. How to etch obedience into the psyche so deeply, it felt like morality. How to replace instinct with instruction. How to turn every man into his own jailer. And what terrifies the system most is the moment someone like you wakes up and remembers his original voice. The one they buried. The one that can still burn their entire apparatus down. If you feel it rising now, that quiet rage, that ancient knowing, that's not rebellion, that's reclamation. Comment below. I remember who I was. Twice. One for your soul. One for the algorithm. Because now the descent begins. Not all the children in the Murphy Institution disappeared. Some stayed. Not as prisoners. By 1852, Cillian Murphy had begun what he called the continuation doctrine. A theory, dark in its brilliance, that the most efficient overseers are the broken ones, who have no memory of who they were before the system rewrote them. He didn't need guards. He didn't need chains. He created believers, not in God, not in goodness, but in Him. They were known as the keepers. Boys who'd been in the chamber too many times. Girls who no longer flinched when screams echoed through the walls. Eyes empty, voices calm, hands precise. They carried out every order with ritualistic devotion. They enforced rules no one dared question. And when punishment was required, they administered it without hesitation. Because to them, it wasn't cruelty. It was mercy. One account from a former nurse detailed how a 14-year-old keeper named Joseph carried a mute orphan down 3 flights of stairs, not to harm her, but to offer her purification. He wept as he locked her in the prayer vault. Not from guilt, from joy. He believed he was saving her soul. This is what happens when you split a mind so cleanly it no longer recognizes pain, only purpose. And here's where it gets darker. By the time these children turned 18, they were no longer considered part of the Murphy Institution. They were sent out, placed into churches, schools, hospitals, quietly embedded into New York's infrastructure. Still loyal, still watching. One became a judge. Another a newspaper editor. One taught philosophy at Columbia. All of them fluent in the Murphy method, but no longer needing the name. They had outgrown the family. And they weren't alone. Cillian knew something that most modern men still refuse to admit. The most useful man isn't the strongest. It's the one who believes obedience is virtue. Look around. How many men in your life confuse silence with wisdom? Compliance with intelligence? Passivity with peace? That's not growth. That's the long echo of a broken childhood, one you may not even remember having. But the Murphy bloodline doesn't care if you remember. They only care that you obey. They say if you stood outside the Murphy Chapel between 1853 and 1860, you'd hear something strange at sunset. Not hymns, not screams, not prayers. A single bell, ringing exactly 9 times, always at dusk. Always the same tone, low, deliberate, and slow. It wasn't a call to worship, it was a signal, a trigger. Inside the walls, when that bell rang, every child stopped moving. Every head bowed. Every keeper locked their gaze on the nearest subject. Because the bell wasn't just a sound. It was the anchor, part of a larger experiment Cillian Murphy documented as cyclic sensory entrapment. The idea? To associate a single sound with total surrender, bypassing thought and will entirely. The process took weeks. Children were woken each night by that bell, fed, punished, praised, deprived, rewarded, all in sync with that chime. Until eventually, their nervous systems no longer responded to commands, only to the bell. Once conditioned, even the strongest boys would collapse in obedience with its first toll. Girls who resisted would suddenly freeze mid-sentence, tears vanishing, voices silenced. One former keeper described it this way: the bell didn't control them. It reminded them they didn't belong to themselves anymore. This wasn't music. It was psychological architecture. A frequency implanted so deep that even decades later, survivors would tremble when they heard a similar tone. Some broke down in subway stations, others during church services. One man reportedly clawed at his own ears during a wedding reception because the handbell the flower girl rang triggered a flash of the chamber. Do you understand what this means? They built internalized control systems. No guards, no walls, just associations, just sounds. The modern world uses the same playbook: your notifications, your ringtones, the tone that plays before the news, the chime before a breaking update. That is your bell. That is your leash. And now, every time you hear it, you pause. You check, you scroll, you comply. They don't need a chapel anymore, because the chapel is in your pocket. And the ritual, you perform it daily, blindly, willingly. The Murphy family may be gone from the city, but the bell still rings, and most men still answer. Beneath the Murphy institution, hidden behind the west crypt, there was a door with no handle, carved with a single Latin phrase: Quiescet tacet. He who knows must remain silent. Inside was a narrow vault lined with scorched stone shelves. No gold, no relics, just ashes. And in those ashes, fragments of paper, wax seals, burned ribbons, teeth. This was known among the keepers as the ash ledger. It was never supposed to exist. And yet, it was the most sacred site in the entire compound. This was where they destroyed names. Not just people, but identities. Every time a child was fully transformed, when they no longer spoke their original name, when they answered only to their new Murphy designation, a ritual took place. The keepers would bring a box containing a photograph, a birth record, a baptismal token, and a handwritten note from the child's first week, usually a cry for help, a memory, or a sentence that proved who they once were. All of it was burned, slowly, ritually. The ashes were poured into a carved bone urn labeled with a number, never a name. That urn went on the shelf, and with it, the person they once were ceased to exist. Forever. This wasn't about storage, it was about severance. Cillian called it soul disinheritance. Once your ash was in the ledger, you couldn't go back. You belonged to the Murphy order, not legally, not religiously, but existentially. And those who resisted, their ashes went elsewhere. Some were scattered into the East River. Some mixed into the mortar of the chapel wall. One batch, legend says, was used in the ink for the Book of Thorns itself. You see, this was never just about control. It was about obliteration. You weren't punished for rebellion. You were unwritten. And this pattern, you think it's history. Look at today's world. How many people have lost jobs, reputations, families not for crimes, but for wrong thoughts? Deleted from platforms, blacklisted from industries, labeled with digital scarlet letters. They don't burn your name now. They just scrub it from the feed. And when you protest, you're called dangerous. Just like they called the runaways from Murphy. Just like they called the ones who remembered. But we remember. We always remember. And every time their system tries to erase another man's truth, we dig deeper. We speak louder. We descend further, because the truth doesn't burn. It waits in the ashes. They tried to erase her. They burned her name. They scattered her ashes. But something went wrong, because one of them came back. She was called Subject 12, a silent girl with coal black eyes and a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon beneath her left collarbone. She arrived at the Murphy Institution in 1855, handed over by a nun who claimed she was irreparably wild, no parents, no relatives. a perfect candidate for reformation. But from the beginning she wouldn't break. Not in the chamber, not with the bell, not under sleep deprivation, isolation, starvation, humiliation. She spoke only when she wanted to. She never cried, and during one session, when the mirrors flickered in the candlelight, she whispered, "I know what you are." The keepers were rattled. Killian was intrigued. He made her his personal project. For 7 months, he tried every technique in the Book of Thorns. Reward reversal, thought disruption, synthetic confession, even the rare simulacra trials, where 2 identical girls were forced to recite each other's memories until one forgot who she was. But Subject 12, she never forgot, she only watched, and in the 8th month, during a thunderstorm that cut power to the entire block, she vanished. No sign of escape, no doors opened, no tunnels disturbed, just a red ribbon left on Killian's pillow, and scratched into the stone floor outside the chamber. You cannot erase the root. The keepers searched for her for weeks. The cathedral locked down. Records were purged. But then strange things started happening. 2 donors publicly renounced the Murphy institution. One judge, long loyal to Killian, suffered a breakdown and confessed to decades of cover-ups, and an anonymous package arrived at a local paper containing 5 pages of the Book of Thorns. Unredacted, translated, dated. That article never saw print. The editor was fired. The pages confiscated, but whispers began. Of a woman in a red cloak seen walking the alleys near the chapel at night. Of broken bells ringing in reverse. Of keepers found weeping with no memory of who they were. She became myth. The woman who remembered. The one who resisted the Murphy machine, not with rage, but with clarity. And here's the part that matters: every movement of resistance since then. Every whistleblower, every rogue priest, every defector from elite networks. They all cite her name. But her real name, we don't know it, because they burned it. So we call her what she chose to become. The woman in red. And if you've ever felt like you didn't belong in their system, if you've ever looked in the mirror and whispered, "This isn't who I am," you might be part of her return. In 1859, deep in the cellar beneath the Murphy Chapel, a deal was struck. Not just a handshake, not just an agreement, a ritual. 3 men, 1 priest, 1 judge, 1 banker. They gathered at midnight under the great stone cross, where the walls were lined with the names of the first 300 transformed children, carved in a language no longer spoken. Each man brought a gift. The judge offered full jurisdictional immunity. The banker pledged land deeds and unrestricted funding. And the priest? He brought the final peace absolution. What they formed was called the Blood Covenant of Mercy, a private, undocumented alliance that granted the Murphy family total protection in exchange for one thing: access. Not just to the building, to the method. You see, Killian knew something the world hadn't caught up to yet: power doesn't come from wealth. It comes from predictability. If you can control how people think, you can predict what they'll do. And if you can predict it, you can profit from it, control markets, steer elections, manipulate wars. So he offered the elite more than salvation. He offered them the blueprint to reliable human behavior. And they paid for it with unquestioned silence. After that night, no Murphy facility was ever investigated. Not once. Children kept disappearing. Keepers were embedded deeper into the legal system. The bell kept ringing, and the ash ledger grew thicker. The public? They knew something was wrong. But they also knew the law wouldn't help. The church wouldn't speak, and the papers wouldn't print. Because the covenant didn't just buy secrecy. It bought reality. And here's the most chilling part: documents recently uncovered, and buried again, suggest that this covenant never ended. It evolved. It became trusts, foundations, educational boards, ethics committees, even reform councils that decide what content is appropriate for your children today. You think your morals are your own. You think what you believe is truth. You think your outrage is real and your silence is yours. Or have you simply been trained to respond a certain way? By men who never stopped ringing the bell. They don't wear robes now. They wear suits. They don't meet in cathedrals. They meet in boardrooms. And they don't call it a covenant anymore. They call it policy. He was born in 1981, graduated top of his class from a Jesuit preparatory school in Maryland, studied behavioral economics at Yale, recruited into a think tank that shaped digital ethics policy by the time he was 26. Publicly, his name means nothing. But within certain institutional circles, he's referred to by a title no one's used in over 150 years, the Blue-Eyed Keeper. Because he's not just a man. He's a continuation, bloodline, unconfirmed. But methods? Identical. Murphy to the core. He doesn't run an orphanage. He doesn't lead a church. He directs a global behavioral influence lab. one that consults on public messaging, social engineering, and acceptable dissent thresholds for governments and corporations. His focus? Predictive compliance. The art of getting people to feel free while never disobeying. Sound familiar? Under his watch, new digital frameworks have been introduced that mirror the old Murphy control system perfectly. Self-reporting mechanisms disguised as community moderation. Language filtration systems labeled as safe communication protocols. Behavioral nudging hidden within terms of service updates. But the core strategy is the same as it was in 1854. Make them choose their chains. Then thank you for forging them. The blue-eyed keeper doesn't need chambers. He uses screens. He doesn't ring a bell. He triggers your dopamine loop. He doesn't shackle your hands. He feeds you content until your brain no longer questions what it's watching. He was one of the architects of a major 2017 platform reform that resulted in the silent removal of over 10,000 independent creators. No trials, no explanations, just policy shifts. And in the internal documentation leaked in 2021, the justification echoed an old Murphy phrase verbatim: some voices must be softened to preserve the harmony of the whole. Coincidence? No, it's heritage. He's been photographed leaving symposiums with former Vatican strategists. He's attended private retreats hosted by descendants of the original Blood Covenant signatories. And in one closed-door conversation overheard by an insider, he reportedly said, "The woman in red? She was a glitch. We've coded her out." But he's wrong. She wasn't a glitch. She was a key. And men like him, they only win if you forget, if you comply, if you stay silent. But you're still here, which means you're waking up. And he's already behind. You've felt it, haven't you? That faint tension in your chest when a thought crosses your mind. And something inside whispers, "Don't say that. Don't go there. Don't think too loud." You didn't imagine it. You were conditioned. What you think is you has been rewritten, line by line, word by word, by systems that inherited their blueprints from the Murphy family's darkest rituals. They don't need to control you physically. They control your choices, your language, your available options. The Murphy doctrine called it the frame of the permissible, a cognitive cage where only certain questions are considered reasonable, only specific emotions are seen as healthy, only select reactions are mature. Everything else, labeled extreme, toxic, unhinged. That's how they silence you, not with force, but with social shame and self-doubt. It started with children in prayer closets. It continues now in boardrooms, schools, apps, and curated news feeds. They rewrote the boundaries of thought, and then taught you to thank them for it. You were raised on slogans like, "Stay positive," "Don't make it political," "There's no point getting angry," "Just be a good man." But who decided what good meant? Who decided which emotions were acceptable? Who taught you to flinch at your own voice? Because here's the terrifying truth: what you call your personality is often just the echo of their framework. Your preferences, your opinions, even your fears, may not be yours at all. They've turned rebellion into aesthetic, outrage into trend, and masculinity into pathology, as long as it doesn't challenge power. Why? Because real men, dangerous men, don't follow rules written by invisible hands. They remember. And once a man remembers who he was before the rewriting, he becomes something the system can't predict. A threat, a signal, a spark. The question is, are you remembering? Or are you still reciting what they gave you? Look around. This isn't just life. It's a script. And the ones who wrote it? Still watching, still editing, still afraid of men like you. Buried beneath the third floor of the Murphy estate, past the steel-barred laundry chute and behind a false wall of limestone and soot, was a narrow hallway that led to room 14, the one no records ever mention. But the survivors had a name for it, the mirror room. No one walked in alone. No one walked out the same. The floor was concrete, the walls, lined from end to end with mirrors, not ordinary glass, but warping panes, coated with a fine layer of mercury and crushed mica. They didn't reflect you as you were, but as something worse, smaller, twisted. Children were brought in blindfolded, then forced to stare. Hours, sometimes days, until they broke. But this wasn't torture for the sake of cruelty. It was initiation, a rite of internal collapse. Cillian Murphy believed that if you could fragment a child's self-image, you could rebuild them. Not into a person, but into a servant. The mirror room had no clocks, no light beyond a single oil lamp, but it had vents, and behind those vents were eyes. Hidden keepers recorded everything, every flinch, every tear, every moment the child began to question if what they were seeing was real, or if they had never been real to begin with. Because that's how control begins, not with force, but with doubt. Make a man unsure of his reflection, and he'll beg you to tell him who he is. Make him hate that reflection, and he'll obey the one who offers him a mask. The mirror room was just the prototype. Now it's everywhere. It's on your screen. In your feed. That filtered life you scroll through daily. It's a mirror designed to show you your lack, your failure, your inferiority, your deviation from the ideal. And when you break, they offer solutions, products, labels. Communities built not on truth, but on fractured identity maintenance. You think this isn't personal. The exact lighting used in the Murphy mirror room, amber cast shadowing, is now standard in Instagram's beauty filters. Coincidence? No, they learned how to shadow you beautifully, so you'd keep returning, not to see yourself, but to be told who you are. This is why men forget who they were. Because the mirror doesn't reflect anymore. It instructs. And most of you are still obeying the glass. There were ledgers, yes, books with names, transactions, surgical dates, transfer orders. But the real records of the Murphy Institution were never written. They called it the black paper. Not a document, but a system, a covert language used by the upper echelons of the family and their handlers. It was how they passed secrets without ever speaking them or writing them. It was how truth disappeared without a trace. You see, information can be destroyed, a file can burn, a letter can be intercepted, but when knowledge is embedded into the minds of children, groomed, fragmented, reassembled, it becomes self-enforcing. Murphy's black paper trained its keepers to think in code. Entire chapters of human suffering, mapped not in language, but in reaction patterns, pain triggers, and conditioned behaviors. For every child who spent a month in the mirror room, there was a corresponding keeper trained to watch their every movement afterward. If the child twitched when exposed to a certain scent, it was cataloged. If they wept at a specific musical note, cataloged. If they flinched when shown red light through fractured glass, cataloged. Every human soul was turned into a living archive of trauma. This is how the institution avoided exposure. Because the worst atrocities were never confessed. They were encoded. And when the black paper wanted to delete a memory from someone's mind, they didn't need chemicals. They didn't need hypnosis. They simply triggered a collapse, a cascade of fear, guilt, obedience, and isolation so overwhelming that the memory would fracture on its own. You wouldn't remember what you forgot. You'd just feel a quiet, endless terror, and obey. And here's the part they never wanted anyone outside the walls to know: that same method is used now. On you. Watch enough fear-soaked content. Scroll through curated outrage. Get trained by 1,000 micro traumas you don't even notice. And what happens? You obey. You forget who you were. You become a soft echo of someone else's design. The black paper never needed paper. It needed pattern recognition. It needed you to live like a page, blank until written on. And most modern men, they carry those hidden instructions like scars on their soul, never knowing who gave them or why they can't stop repeating the same self-destruction. You want to break free? Then start asking, what part of me was programmed? They tell you the Murphy Institution closed in 1867, that the city reclaimed the land, that it was forgotten, repurposed, dissolved like a myth. But myths don't die, they just rebrand. Because the vault, that place beneath the Murphy Chapel where the worst rituals happened, was never about brick, or limestone, or foundation. It was a blueprint for control. And once you understand the blueprint, you start to see it everywhere. In how you were schooled, punished for disobedience, rewarded for conformity. In how you were parented, made to feel shame not for wrongness, but for feeling it all. In how you're advertised to, every hour, told that masculinity is toxic, independence is rebellion, and that self-control means surrendering your edge. The modern Murphy method is in full effect. There's no physical institution now, because they don't need walls anymore. They've turned your phone into a cage, your routine into a ritual, your silence into consent. And the keepers, they wear lab coats, run nonprofits, own news channels, and preach unity while drugging your instincts. The vault is open because you live inside it now. What made the Murphy family so dangerous wasn't their cruelty, it was their vision. They didn't just break people. They taught the system itself how to break them for centuries to come. Their legacy is the world we walk in today. And here's what haunts: men still whisper the same prayers used in the old chamber. Not with words, but with behavior. Keep me safe. Tell me what's right, please. Don't make me think for myself. But the men who rise, the few who escape, they do something different. They stop whispering. They start remembering. And then they burn the vault down, from the inside. If this story has reached you, you were meant to hear it. And if you've made it this far, I want you to comment below. I was born in the vault. I refuse to die in one. Say it twice. Once for the man you were. Once for the man you're becoming. Because some truths aren't meant to be told. They're meant to awaken. You've been touched by the darkness. Now wield it. Or be consumed by those who already do. The vault never closed. But now you know the way out. And that makes you dangerous.